Hello there, music lovers, and welcome to the channel. And I want to thank you for stopping by, taking time out of your day to check out these videos. And in this one, I'm going to give you my review of that brand new Queen movie, Bohemian Rhapsody, which I want to know if you have already seen it and what you think about it. This thing has been pulling in huge numbers, much better than I expected it to do, actually, especially since the reviews going into it were kind of lukewarm. But it's done over $100 million in just 10 or so days. It's on track to becoming like the biggest biopic ever. And the soundtrack is doing well too. I think it's in the top 5 of the Billboard album charts. So Queen is definitely the flavor of the moment. And I just wanted to go through this video, give you my thoughts about the movie. After watching it and thinking about it, what I've come to realize is this, that Queen's history is really pretty boring. It's pretty, and it's like an unremarkable history. And by that, and not so much the history, but the story. Okay, the music is exciting. Queen's live performances are exciting. No question about that. When Freddie got sick and then Queen started making albums and they stopped touring, there was a lot of drama around that, a lot of interesting things, a lot of heartfelt stuff, a lot of very touching things that, encompass that. But the movie doesn't even get to that point of Queen's career. And I felt that in order to make Queen's history interesting, they had to make shit up. I mean, I can stand here or sit here and tell you that, Queen's story is pretty boring, and you can say, oh, that's bullshit. But then if that's the case, then why did they have to make up history to make it interesting? Because that's what I found that this movie did. And I'll give you an example. The movie starts off, we see how, Freddie Mercury meets Mary Austin, who is like the love of his life, and how he gets to meet Brian and Roger and actually join Queen. And according to the movie, Freddie goes to this gig for the band Smile, which was this 3-piece band that preceded Queen. It was fronted by this guy named Tim Staffel, who played bass and was the lead singer. And Freddie kind of admires them from afar, and you can get the sense that he knows that he could be the lead singer in that, group. And so when he goes to the gig, he meets Mary. And then a few minutes after that, he finds out from Brian and Roger that Tim just left to go join this other band. And so Freddie auditions for Brian and Roger out in the parking lot. And they basically, at first are like, you got buck teeth. There's no way you're going to front this band. And then he sings for them and their tune changes, which is total bullshit. That's not the way it went down. Freddie actually was already friends with Mary Austin before he got into Queen. He even knew Tim Staffel, the lead singer of Smile. Tim is the one who introduced him to Brian and Roger. And as a matter of fact, Mercury was already living with Brian and Roger at the time that he joined Queen. So you can see that they had to make stuff up. They had to build in this fake history to make a story, because there's really not a whole lot there that they could really go with. And then, then we start getting into some timeline type of issues. We start seeing them, do their first album and go on their first tour of the U.S. And while they're going on their first tour of the U.S. in 1974, we're listening to Fat Bottom Girls, which, didn't come out till like 1978 or so. So there's stuff like that that goes on. And then we get to this part of the film where we start talking about A Night at the Opera. And, that's the album that's got Bohemian Rhapsody and how that song was made and, getting this 6-minute song out onto the radio. And we're introduced to this character named Ray Foster, who was like this record executive who just, he didn't really dig Queen, didn't dig the direction that they were going in. He had a certain way that he wanted them to sound. He didn't like the idea of a 6-minute song out on the radio. He fought them tooth and nail. This character, Ray Foster, is played by Mike Myers, and this is an imaginary character. He didn't exist. He was based on a character named Ray Featherstone, who liked Queen. He wasn't crazy about the 6-minute bow rap, but he generally liked Queen. But that doesn't really play too well in a film, because in a film you need drama. You need somebody there to be fighting you. There's always a hero, and there's always someone fighting the hero. And Ray Foster was this made-up character just to add some drama. And of course, Mike Myers, he looks good in the makeup. He kind of reminded me of like Jeff Lynne if he had a haircut. He looked really good. And of course, there's a tongue-in-cheek reference to Wayne's World, which was his 1991 movie where, he and Dana Carvey were banging their heads to Bohemian Rhapsody. That introduced a whole new generation to, Queen and Bohemian Rhapsody and all that stuff. And so I can see why they put him in there. But again, getting back to having to make stuff up in order to make things interesting, because just having Ray Featherstone, basing it purely on him, not enough there to really have the anti-hero thing going on. Then we start getting into Freddie's sexuality. We've seen him with Mary Austin, who was this woman that he met before he joined Queen, and he he was very much in love with her, although he was conflicted. He even proposes to her and she accepts, but she can tell that there's something up with him. And we start to get an indication that Freddie is, going off with guys. It's very, very muted. He goes to a truck stop, goes to a payphone and calls up Mary. And while he's talking to her, this truck driver gets out of his truck, giving Freddie the eye, goes into the bathroom. Freddie's so you kind of get the impression that Freddie's about to follow this stranger into a men's room at a truck stop, So we get these indications. Interestingly enough, the truck driver in that scene was a cameo by Adam Lambert, which I thought was pretty funny, how they worked him into it too. But the movie never really gets into the real dark side of Freddie Mercury. And this is something that I had been wondering about many, many months ago. I did a video wondering how far they were going to go with this. Freddie got into some pretty dark areas. And his friends, those close to him, were very concerned about him. He notoriously told one of his friends, when they asked him, we got AIDS, or have you done anything to change your behavior? And Freddie infamously says, fuck it, I'm doing everything with everybody. And that was his attitude. And, whether it was in New York, clubs there, or in Munich, Freddie was off the chain. And we don't get a real sense of that here. We do see him partying, and we see the band kind of not really crazy about the direction that he's going in, but we don't really see the real sense of worry that his friends had for him. And, of course, he comes out to Mary and he tells her that he's bisexual, and she's like, well, you really mean gay. And so that was pretty much the end of that. They remained friends, and that's actually true. Freddie and Mary remained friends right up until the end. He even left her his estate. He always felt that he could trust her. And that's one of the things about this movie, if I had to have a pros and cons list, is that the movie does a good job of establishing the relationship between him and Mary Austin. And you can definitely see that there's a sweetness there. There's a romance there, even though it's kind of, that it really can't happen. You can tell when Freddie gets jealous when she brings around a boyfriend, and then she has a baby, and so he starts to feel some things about her, and she can tell that. So there's that kind of element going on here. But really, Mary Austin is like a recluse now. She doesn't spill her guts. She hasn't written a book about her life with Freddie. She's honoring him as much as possible just by staying quiet and not going into anything. And I kind of feel like Brian and Roger are kind of almost following suit here based on how this movie is portraying Freddie. They portray him as a genius, as somebody who kind of knows what he wants and goes after it. And that's like regardless of the risks, whether it's musical or sexual, but they don't get into the dark side of Freddie. We might see after a party, there's a table that's got powder on it, but we don't see him doing drugs, and we just don't see all of that really went on. And so what I'm basically trying to say is that Freddie's sexuality is kind of sanitized for this PG-13 movie. And I think that, that's basically meant to preserve the legacy of Queen in a certain way. So then there's also more timeline issues. Like, we see Freddie at this party that he that he calls for, and they're playing Super Freak by Rick James, and this crazy little thing called Love playing. So you kind of get the sense that this is the time that we're in now, the early 80s, right? Well, then we get to them doing We Will Rock You and coming up with that, which was 1977. And Freddie is standing there while they're coming up with the song with his famous mustache. So it's like the timelines of things are really screwy. They're very, very liberal with when things happened. And so you can tell at this point that they have invented things. They've created characters like Ray Foster. They've manipulated history, like when Freddie met Queen. And, they couldn't go with the way things really happened. They had to, basically retell a story in a certain way to build drama. They're not paying attention to timelines. This movie may have taken 10 years to make, but they didn't spend 10 years fact-checking and making sure that it was totally accurate. This movie spent most of that 10 years trying to figure out, well, who's going to direct this? Who's going to play Freddie? What's the script going to be? And this film generally came out, probably in the past 2 or 3 years is really when they spent the most time working on it. And there's another scene where things are made up. We get to this part where Freddie is in a limousine with his manager, John Reed, the band's manager. And John Reed is telling Freddie, look, Michael Jackson left the Jackson 5 and look what happened to him, Freddie, you're a star, you could go solo and all this stuff. And, Freddie bristles at that idea of going solo. And he basically tells John, get out of the car, he fires him. And that's not the way it happened. That's all bullshit. John Reed left Queen amicably in 1977, not around the early 80s. And he didn't throw him out of a car, and there was nothing crazy going over the solo deal that Freddie would eventually get. And that's another thing, is that this movie makes such a big deal over Freddie going solo. When we start getting into the second half of the film, it's like all bets are off. Shit just starts going crazy. Let's just start making stuff up to add in drama. Freddie going solo, when he tells the band that he's going to go solo, they go ballistic on him, which is not true, because Freddie was like the last guy in the band to go solo. Roger Taylor, the drummer, already had 2 solo albums out. Brian May already had a solo album out. As a matter of fact, he did this pretty interesting album with Eddie Van Halen called Starfleet Project, which has never come out on CD. And I'm wondering why. I don't know if Eddie's got something to do with that, and of course, John Deacon never came out with the solo album. So, it's just kind of silly that we go through this whole thing with Freddie, because when we get to the whole Live Aid thing, they make it sound like Queen hadn't played together in years. And that, it's like, what is the audience going to think about Queen, playing this kind of show? And it's just bullshit. In reality, Queen put this album out called The Works, the one that had Radio Gaga and I Want to Break Free. And they toured that album up until May of 1985. And just a few weeks later, they went to Live Aid. Queen also were used to playing stadiums. They were used to playing football stadiums. Playing at Live Aid, as great as that performance was, this wasn't some newbie band playing in front of 70,000 people. Queen was used to it. Freddie knew how to hold an audience like that in the palm of his hand. What was so amazing about that concert was that it wasn't his audience. That audience was not there specifically for Queen, but it looked like a Queen concert. That's one of the most amazing things about it that I don't really hear a lot of people talk about. But, there was a lot of drama built around, Freddie wanted to do Live Aid, but he wanted to get his band back. And so they had this meeting. They even told Freddie to go outside while they talked about things. And there was just so much unnecessary drama that was just made up out of thin air that it's just crazy, and then they go to Live Aid. And, while they're rehearsing, that's when Freddie breaks it to them that he's got AIDS. Freddie, there was a scene where he's doing his solo album and he coughs up blood into a tissue. And you can get the sense that Freddie is starting to wonder about if he's sick. And so he tells the band at the rehearsal for Live Aid that he has AIDS. And it's very unremarkable that the band is like, oh, we're sorry, Freddie. And Freddie's just like, no, I don't want to talk about it. Let's just go out there and blow the roof off the place. And they're like, well, there's no roof at Wembley, that kind of stuff. So anyway, That didn't happen. You know, Freddie didn't even know that he had AIDS until 2 years after Live Aid in 1987. Now, how much Freddie felt inside that he was sick, only Freddie knows that. We don't really know what Freddie knew. We do know that in the tour that Queen did after Live Aid, the one that they did in 1986, Freddie was out of breath. His bandmates were starting to be concerned about him. That's when we started to see the concern of people around him as to his health, because he wasn't performing up to his usual standard. But the movie never gets to that point. So I guess you could say that there are things in this movie that happened, but they may not have happened at that time or for that particular reason. So this movie is just kind of a blend, a mixture of truth and fiction and things getting twisted. And if that's your kind of movie, then go for it. I know there's plenty of people who, you know, they're mildly into Queen. They've heard them on the radio and they just want to go to hear the music and see an interesting movie. And it just kind of will go over a lot of people's heads. But, you know, I've been a fan of Queen since I'm like 10 years old. I know a lot about the band. I lived a lot of this stuff. And so, you know, it just kills me that they're just twisting things and making up stuff and lying, basically. I've read articles of, you know, kids who talk about having gone to see this movie 2-3 times because they want to learn about Queen. And let me tell you something, this is not the movie to go learn about Queen, okay? Do not go to this movie to get your facts. Don't. If you want to learn about Queen, you need to see some documentaries, because as I said at the beginning of this video, Queen's history is boring. It does not make for a Hollywood film, although they did. And you got to make shit up to make it interesting, but it does not make an interesting film if you just go with the straight facts. Queen's history is best told, I think, in a documentary, and there have already been a few that are really, really good. I did a video many months ago where I talked about one of them. I think it was from Australia. That was a mixture of real interviews with people close to the band, people close to Freddie, and even some like reenactments by some pretty cool actors, and they did a really good job. It was gripping, it was gritty, and it told a lot of the stories that this movie never told. And I think that you get a much accurate depiction of Freddie and the band as a result of documentaries than you do in this kind of sanitized, shiny, glossy, happy-go-lucky movie that really doesn't address the history of Queen. But, you know, this is why, you know, you've got Brian May and Roger Taylor involved, is because they want to control the history. They want to rewrite history. And, you know, I'm trying not to knock Brian May and Roger Taylor, because these guys were my idols growing up. I love these dudes. But doing this movie, being involved the way they are, they have a chance to rewrite history and to control the legacy of Queen going forward, because this is a film that generations going forward are going to see. And some of these people are going to watch these movies and they're going to come away with a different impression of Queen, one that's not accurate. And I don't like that. So I say check out documentaries. I'm going to put a link to that below. And I've also got a playlist that I put together, some killer Queen. So you can check that out below. And, you know, just check the description for some other things. But basically, I want to talk, before we wrap things up, what this movie got right. Okay, the casting was really, really good. Especially, of course, Freddie. You know, Rami Malek does a great Freddie. Now, he doesn't look exactly like him. He's got these bug eyes. There was a scene where they had this press conference in the early 80s, and man, Rami looked just like Freddie. He had the shades on, and he's sitting there, and it looked just like Freddie Mercury. One thing about Rami Malek is that he had Freddie's moves. He had the moves down. You know, very, very well done, especially when they did the whole Live Aid recreation, which was another thing about this film that was really good. Anytime we got to a segment where the band was on stage, they did a great job recreating the stage sets, the costumes, Rami Malek's moves. He emulated Freddie to a T. And, you know, when I first heard that they were going to recreate the Live Aid set, like 20 minutes of it, I was like, wow. I don't know what to expect with that, because it's one thing to do a brief scene where Queen is on stage, but to focus on it solely for 15 minutes, you better have it right or it's going to come off as a shit show. But fortunately, they did a really good job recreating that whole thing. Like Rami Malek's moves, he had everything down, and down to the interplay between he and the cameraman during certain points. They did a really good job with that. The Brian May character, he's overshadowed by Freddie. But the Brian May character, I mean, he not only looked like Brian, but he sounded just like him, had his temperament and his tone. And it was just, I'm sitting here laughing because it's just, Brian May's character is probably the best cast next to Freddie. No question about it, because he was so much like Brian. And the other characters were also very well cast, although a lot of the lines in this movie are just kind of, it seemed like a lot of lines were forced there to either throw out some facts or to prop up Freddie or to maybe do some characterizations. Like we figure out that Roger Taylor likes to chase women based on a couple of things that he says, although we never really get to see him doing that. John Deacon is the witty guy. He doesn't say a whole lot, which I don't think he did a whole lot in Queen anyway. He was always seen as this shy guy, but he was always there to throw out the one-liners and the witty quips. And we don't really get to know a lot of the characters that surround Freddie. We get to know Freddie. We feel for him and maybe for Mary Austin, but we don't get to know the other characters very, very well. There's not a lot of depth there. And then, of course, you've got the soundtrack. This movie's got a lot of great music in it, and I've heard of people going to see this movie a couple of times just to hear the music. And one thing about Queen, you can say that the history is boring, but I think that Queen's music is exciting. It's bombastic as hell, but that's what I love about it. It's very exciting music, whether you're listening to the album or watching them live. Freddie Mercury, in my opinion, was the best frontman ever. He had it all. He could sing anything. He knew how to hold an audience in the palm of his hand, no matter what the size. It seemed like Freddie was Superman, like he could do no wrong when it came to performing live. It's got its good points, but overall, I think this movie is just a mess. And if I had to give it a grade, I'd probably give it a C-. And the only thing that really saves it is the casting and the soundtrack. Other than that, there's really not much here, especially for a real diehard Queen fan. So what do you think? What do you think about this Queen biopic, Bohemian Rhapsody? Have you seen it? Would you recommend it to somebody else? What do you think about the liberal use of facts here? Twisting things, adding things in there. What do you think about how they handled Freddie's sexuality and all the stuff that he was getting into and the whole AIDS thing at Live Aid? What do you think about that? Put it down below, all right? Be sure to leave your comments. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Hit that subscribe button. Check the description for some links to some other stuff I got for you. And I'll see you soon with another video.